The Texas wind carries many things: dust, memories, and sometimes the truth. For years, the Sterling Ranch stood on land shadowed by an old wrong. Wyatt Sterling could have protected his name, his wealth, and his future. Instead, he chose to face the sins of the past. And when Clara Penrose discovers that her family's story was burned, hidden, and nearly forgotten, both of them must decide whether love can grow in soil watered by sorrow. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt Western stories.
The dust in Texas doesn't just sit on you. It claims you. By the time the stagecoach pulled into Bitter Creek, I was more grit than woman. I stepped down, my boots hitting the dry earth with a dull thud. It was 1878, a year for hard choices. I'm Clara Penrose. I am 34, a widow, and I know how to make numbers dance until they tell the truth. That's why the law firm in Denver sent me. Bitter Creek looked like a town built on a dare mostly wood, wind, and secrets. I walked toward Judge Thorne S.'s office. I didn't go there for a welcome. I went there to work. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale tobacco. 2 men were waiting. One was the judge, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of an oak stump. The other was Wyatt Sterling. Wyatt was tall. He had hands that looked like they knew the weight of a fence post and eyes that had seen too many droughts. He didn't move when I walked in. He just watched. "Miss Penrose," the judge said, leaning back, "you re a long way from the city. This is rough country for a woman alone." I set my leather satchel on his desk. I looked him dead in the eye. "Judge," I said, my voice steady, "a womanist mind is just as sharp as any manist ledger. I beam here because I can count, not because I'm looking for a hand to hold. A person's worth shouldn't be measured by the clothes they wear or the gender they were born into, but by the integrity of the work they produce. I am here to do a job. I expect to be treated with the same respect you'd give a man in my boots." The room went quiet. I heard a cicada buzzing outside. Wyatt Sterling finally spoke. His voice was like gravel under a wagon wheel. "She do, Judge." Later that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and gold. I was sitting on the porch of the boarding house, trying to brush the Texas trail off my skirts. Wyatt appeared out of the shadows. He didn't announce himself. He just stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the dark hills. "My Uncle Gideon is coming for the ranch," Wyatt said. He wasn't looking at me. "He's got a lawyer from New Orleans. They found a clause. If I am not settled by the time the hearing starts in 3 weeks, he can claim the land was never legally passed to me. I am an auditor, Mr. Sterling," I replied, "not a miracle worker." He stepped closer. He was near enough that I could smell the wood smoke on his coat. He leaned down on his face inches from mine. "Pretend to be engaged to me," he whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. "You re-asking me to lie," I said, "to the law, to the town." Wyatt looked at me then, truly looked at me. "I know the weight of a man S-word," he said. "Out here, a man's integrity is the only currency that doesn't lose value. But sometimes, Clara, we have to borrow a shadow to protect the light. I'm not asking you to lie for greed. I'm asking you to help me protect a legacy that was built on sweat. My father died for that land. I won't let a thief take it on a technicality." I looked at his calloused hands. I looked at the vast, lonely dark of the Texas night. 3 weeks, I said. 3 weeks, he echoed. He reached out and took my hand. It was supposed to be a rehearsal, a performance. But when his skin touched mine, something shifted. It wasn't a business arrangement anymore. It was a spark in a dry forest, and I knew, right then, that there was no going back. The sun came up over Bitter Creek like a heavy orange eye, unblinking, judging. I watched her from the barn, Clara Penrose. She was standing by the porch, looking out at the ridges as if she were trying to memorize the shape of the world. She didn't look like a city woman anymore. She looked like someone who was waiting for the wind to tell her a secret. I walked up the path. My boots crunched on the dry grass. I didn't say a word until I was standing right beside her. "Sleep well?" I asked. She didn't turn around. "The silence is loud out here, Mr. Sterling." "It's the sound of nothing being built," I said, "or nothing being destroyed. Take your pick." I led her toward the small cabin I used for my records. It was a dusty place. It smelled of old leather, ink, and the kind of history that didn't want to be found. I pulled out a stack of ledgers. They were stained with sweat and age. "My Uncle Gideon is a man of fine suits and foul intentions," I told her, sitting across the small table. "He thinks because he lives in New Orleans, he has a right to tell the dirt here what to do. He found a loophole in my Father S. will. A morality clause, they call it. The land was meant to stay with a family man, a man with a stake in the future. Since I am alone, he says I am just a caretaker. He wants to sell it to the rail companies." Clara touched the edge of a ledger. Her fingers were steady. "And you think a fake engagement will stop a New Orleans lawyer?" "It buys time," I said. "And in Texas, time is the only thing you can't buy more of when you run out. But there's something else, Clara. Something I haven't told the judge." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the way she held herself, like a shield. "I didn't pick your name out of a hat," I said. My voice was low. "I believe that every soul has an inherent right to be seen for who they are, not just for the shadow their family name casts. But I also believe that a man's true character is revealed by how he settles the debts of those who came before him. My father, Thomas Sterling, was a hard man. He was a fair man, mostly. But in 1856, he did something that has rotted in the corners of this ranch for 20 years. Clara stilled. 1856. "There was a man," I continued, "Jonathan Penrose. He had a claim. He had a family. My father wanted the valley to stay together. He didn't use a gun. He used a pen. He made life hard. He made the water disappear. He drove Jonathan Penn out of Bitter Creek." Clara's breath hitched, a tiny sound, like a leaf snapping. "I knew your name was Penrose the moment I saw the audit request," I said. "A person's dignity isn't something that can be stolen, but it can be suppressed. I believe that justice isn't just about following the rules in a book. It is about the active restoration of what was taken. It's about making right what was once made wrong. I brought you here, Clara, because I'm tired of living in a house built on someone else's loss. I'm not just asking you to be my fiancée. I'm asking you to help me find the truth in these books so I can give back what my father took." She looked down at her hands. She was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the clock on the wall, ticking like a heartbeat. "You re a strange man, Wyatt Sterling," she whispered. "I'm a man who wants to sleep at night," I said. "We are all born with the same right to exist and thrive, regardless of where we started. If I keep this land while knowing it was built on a lie, I am no better than the man who stole it." She looked up. Her eyes were bright, maybe with anger, maybe with something else. "Let's look at the books, Wyatt," she said. And for the first time, she didn't call me Mr. Sterling. The town social was held under a string of lanterns in the square. The music of a lone fiddle scratched at the night air. It was a happy sound, but it felt thin, like it could break if the wind blew too hard. Wyatt stood beside me. He was dressed in a clean black coat. He looked like a stranger, or maybe I was the stranger. I felt everyone watching. The women in their gingham dresses, the men with their hats tipped low. They were looking for a crack in the story. They were looking for the lie. "Smile," Clara, Wyatt whispered. He leaned close. You look like you re-walking to the gallows. I never been a good liar. Wyatt, I said. He walked. There were my eyes, so it was soft from too much, just straight. And this Mund be the lady from Denver. I didn't know you had a taste for auditors, nephew. Wyatt's hand on the small of my back. It was warm, steady. Clara is more than an auditor, Gideon, Wyatt said. She's the future of Sterling Ranch. Gideon laughed. It was a cold sound. A sudden match. Very convenient for the hearing. Tell me, Miss Penrose, does Wyatt know that a marriage built on a contract is just a prison with better scenery? I stepped forward. I didn't let my hand shake. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying over the fiddle music, I believe that the value of a human heart is not found in how much land it owns, but in the promises it keeps. A person's right to choose their own path is the most sacred thing they possess. I didn't come here because of a contract. I came here because I saw a man who was trying to do what was right. True compassion isn't about being nice. It is about standing up for the truth even when it is uncomfortable. To give your word to another person is to give them a piece of your life. And I don't give my life away lightly. Gideon's smile faded. He looked at me with a new kind of interest. A dangerous kind. A pretty speech, Gideon said, but words are cheap. Out here, we believe in what we can see. He looked around at the crowd. They were leaning in, waiting. If this is a match made in heaven, Gideon challenged, then show us. Or are you waiting for the judge to give you permission? The air went still. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at Wyatt. He was looking at me. His eyes were asking a question. Can you do this? I didn't answer with words. I reached up and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. Wyatt leaned down. He didn't hesitate. When his lips touched mine, the world disappeared. The lanterns, the fiddle, the prying eyes of Bitter Creek, it all went black. It wasn't a staged kiss. It wasn't a performance for Gideon or the judge. It was a collision. It tasted of salt and desperation. It tasted like the truth we both were trying to hide. His hand moved to my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. It was a claim. Everything changed in that second. The fake engagement shattered. The lie died. What was left was something raw and irreversible. I pulled back, gasping for air. My face was hot. Wyatt was staring at me, his chest heaving. He looked as shocked as I felt. Gideon stayed silent. He turned on his heel and walked away into the dark. But I didn't care about Gideon anymore. I looked at Wyatt. I used to think that a commitment was just a series of rules. I whispered, my voice trembling. But I was wrong. A real commitment is an act of courage. It is this choice to let someone else see the parts of you that you kept hidden for years. And once you let them in, you can never really be alone again. Wyatt didn't say anything. He just took my hand. He squeezed it once, hard. The fiddle music started up again. But the rhythm had changed. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. We walked away from the lanterns and into the shadows of the Texas night. We were still pretending to the world. But as we walked, I knew one thing for certain. There was nothing fake about the way my heart was beating, and there was no way to turn back the clock. The morning after the social, the air felt different. It was heavy, charged, like the silence right before a summer storm breaks over the plains. I stood by the pump, splashing cold water on my face, trying to wash away the memory of that kiss. But you can't wash away a fire that has already started in the tall grass. I looked toward the house. Clara was already out on the porch. She had her ledger tucked under her arm. Her hair was pulled back tight. Professional. She looked like she was back to business. But I saw the way her fingers lingered on the railing. She was thinking about it, too. We have a lot of ground to cover, mister. Sterling, she said as I approached. I thought we were past Mr. Sterling after last night, I said. She didn't look at me. Last night was for the town. Today is for the truth. I need to see the north pasture. I need to see the head of cattle you're reclaiming in the 1876 report. Paper can lie, Wyatt. Dirt usually doesn't. I nodded. I respected that. I believe that honesty isn't just about telling the truth when someone is looking, said, looking her in the eye. It's about making sure your internal tally matches the world you show to others. A man who lies to himself about the state of his own fence is a man who's already lost his land. Integrity is a quiet thing, Clara. It's what you do when the judge isn't in the room. She looked at me then. A long, steady look, then, let's go see how quiet your integrity is. We rode out together. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the red Texas earth. Clara didn't complain. She sat her horse better than most city folk. She watched everything, the way the grass was grazed, the way the water ran in the creek. We stopped at the old line shack near the boundary. The gate was hanging by a single, rusted hinge. It had been on my list to fix for 3 months. I just never had the time. I started to make an excuse. The winter was hard on the hardware. Don't, she interrupted. She hopped down from her horse. She didn't wait for me to help her. She walked over to the gate, inspecting the wood. I am not here to judge your chores, Wyatt. I am here to assess the value of the stewardship. But look at this. She pointed to the hinge. It wasn't just rusted. It was snapped. You've been trying to hold this together with baling wire, she said. I learned that the way a person treats smallest parts of their life tells you everything about how they'll handle the big ones. Dignity isn't just a word for speeches. It is in the maintenance of things. It is in showing respect for the tools and the land that provide for you. If you don't respect the gate, you don't truly respect the cattle it keeps. I felt a sting of shame, not because she caught me lagging, but because she was right. You rewrite, I said. I pulled a hammer and a fresh spike from my saddlebag. I let it slide. I let the small things go because the big things were heavy. But every person has a responsibility to the space they occupy. To leave a place better than they found, it is the only real legacy a man can leave. Stewardship is a form of gratitude, and I've been ungrateful. She didn't say it's all right. She just held the gate steady while I hammered the spike home. We worked in silence for a few minutes. The rhythm was good. Hammer, hold. Hammer, hold. When the gate swung smooth again, she wiped the dust from her hands. You're a good worker, Clara, I said. Most women I know. I stopped. I saw her jaw set. Most women you know haven't had to prove their worth every single day just to be allowed in the room, she said. Her voice was sharp, rhythmic. I believe that labor has no gender, Wyatt. A job done well is a job done well, whether the hand holding the hammer is calloused or soft. To suggest that my competence is a surprise because I am a woman is to deny me my basic right to be seen as an individual. We all deserve to be judged by the fruit of our labor, not by the expectations society places on our shoulders. I took off my hat. I felt the heat of the sun on my head. I hear you, I said. I was wrong to frame it that way. Every human being possesses the same inherent right to contribute, to build, and to be recognized for their skill. To limit a person based on their birth is a theft of their potential. I won't make that mistake again. She nodded once. The tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. We rode back toward the main house as the shadows started to stretch long across the scrub. We'd seen the cattle. We'd seen the pastures. I knew the numbers would be right. My father might have been a thief, but he wasn't a fool. He kept a tight ranch. But as we crested the final hill, I saw a black buggy sitting in front of my porch. Gideon. He wasn't alone. He had a man with him, a man in a dark suit with a face like a hawk, a lawyer. Clara pulled her horse to a stop. I felt her heart rate pick up from 5 feet away. "He's not waiting for the hearing," she whispered. "No," I said. Gideon never waits for a fair fight. We rode down to meet them. Gideon was leaning against the porch railing, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He looked at Clara, then at me. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. "Lovely day for a ride," Gideon said. "I see the fiancé is getting a tour of the kingdom. Tell me, Miss Penrose, has Wyatt showed you the creek yet? Or the place where the old Penrose cabin used to stand before it was burned out?" I felt Clara stiffen. The secret I'd told her in the cabin. It was in the open now. Gideon was using the truth like a knife. "I've seen enough to know who the rightful owners of this land are, Mr. Sterling," Clara said. Her voice was cold. Gideon chuckled. "I'm sure you have. But my associate here, Mr. Vance, has some questions about your professional standing. It seems the McNally firm in Denver didn't mention you were personally involved with the client." Vance stepped forward. He held up a piece of paper. "Conflict of interest, Miss Penrose. A serious charge in our profession. It could invalidate your entire audit. And without a clean audit, Wyatt has no defense against the morality clause." Gideon leaned in. His eyes were dancing. "I believe that the law is a weapon for the strong to use against the weak," he said. "And I believe that morality is just a story we tell to keep the poor in their place. You thought you could play a game of pretend and win. But the world doesn't care about your feelings, Wyatt. It cares about deeds. And right now, your deeds look like fraud." I stepped in front of Clara. I felt the heat rising in my chest. "I believe that the law exists to protect the vulnerable from the predatory," I said, my voice shaking with a quiet rage. "And I believe that a man who uses the truth to twist a lie is the lowest form of coward. You can threaten the audit, Gideon. You can threaten the land. But you cannot take away the fact that Clara Penrose is a person of honor. And honor is something you will never understand, because it cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be stolen." Gideon just laughed. He climbed into his buggy. "We'll see what the judge thinks of honor in 2 weeks," he said. "Enjoy your ranch while you still have it, nephew. It's a long walk back to Denver. Miss Penrose, I'd start packing those bags." He snapped the reins, and the buggy kicked up a cloud of red dust as it pulled away. I turned to Clara. She was pale. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the reins. I said. Then she looked at me. "Is The first stars began to poke through the dark. We were in trouble. Deep, irreversible trouble. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for the land. I was fighting for the woman standing on it. The night was a heavy blanket. No moon, just the stars, cold and sharp as glass pinned to the black Texas sky. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that kiss. I felt the grit of the ranch. And I felt the shadow of Gideon Sterling, waiting like a vulture on a fence post. I got out of bed. My bare feet found the cool, uneven floorboards. I didn't light a lamp. To the small guest room at the end of So many boxes of paper. I sat on the floor. My hands wandered in the dark until they hit a trunk. It was small, cedar. It smelled of forgotten summers. I pried it open. Inside were maps, not the official ones Wyatt had shown me. These were hand-drawn, scratched onto parchment with a desperate hand. I found a candle and struck a match. The flame sputtered, then grew. In the light, I saw a name. Jonathan Penrose, my father. The map showed the valley, but it was divided different in red. It was with the spread. Data was addressed to my mother back August 1856. It had never been mailed. I read the words. My father's handwriting was different than I remembered. It was shaky. "They are squeezing us, Mary," it read. "The Sterlings have the law on their side because they have the gold to buy the ink. I am being told this land is not for my kind. They say a man from the east has no blood right to the water, but the water belongs to the earth. I am tired of fighting a ghost." The door creaked. I didn't jump. I knew the sound of Wyatt's step by now. He was standing in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the maps. He looked tired, like he'd been carrying the house on his back all night. "You found it," he said. "I found it," I replied. I held up the letter. "My father didn't leave because he was a failure, Wyatt. He left because he was erased. You told me your father drove him out. But this letter says something else. It says he was made to feel like he didn't exist." Wyatt sat on a crate of old tack. He put his head in his hands. "Gideon wasn't lying about the cabin," Wyatt whispered. "My father didn't just take the water. He burned the memories. He wanted to make sure there was no trail for a pen and rose to follow back." I stood up. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the night air. "I believe that every human being has a fundamental, unalienable right to their own history," I said. My voice was low, rhythmic, but it carried the weight of the room. To withhold the truth from a person about where they come from is a form of spiritual theft. A person's past is their property. It is the foundation of their identity. When you burn a man's home and hide his letters, you aren't just taking his land. You are trying to kill his dignity. You are trying to tell him he doesn't matter in the grand tally of the world. White looked up at me. His eyes were dark with a grief that wasn't his own, but one he had inherited. "I know," he said, "and I believe that silence in the face of an old wrong is just as loud as the lie itself. I grew up in this house, eating bread bought with that stolen water. I believe that true justice requires transparency. It requires us to lay every card on the table, no matter how much it hurts to see them. If I keep the secret, I am just a continuation of the fire that burned your father's cabin." I looked back at the map, the red ink, the Penrose patch. "Gideon knows," I said. "He is using this against us because he thinks we're afraid of the mess." "Are you?" Wyatt asked. "I spent my life in Denver trying to be perfect," I said. "I tried to be the widow who never made a mistake, the auditor who never missed a cent, because I thought that was the only way a woman could have a place. But I realized that perfection is a prison. I believe that a person's true worth is found in their willingness to be messy for the sake of what is right. It is better to be a conflict of interest and stand for the truth than to be a perfect professional who stands for nothing." Wyatt stood up. He walked over to me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of him. "I believe that we are not defined by the sins of our fathers, but by how we choose to answer for them," Wyatt said. "The land doesn't care about our names, Clara. It cares about the blood we spill for it and the tears we cry over it. I want to make this right, not because of a hearing, not because of Gideon, but because you have a right to your name. You have a right to stand on this dirt and know that you belong here by more than a lie. The candle flickered. It was almost out. If we tell the judge, I said, the audit is dead. Gideon wins the ranch. You'll be a man with no land, and I'll be an auditor with no career. Then we'll be two people with nothing but the truth, Wyatt said. And I believe that the truth is the only thing that can be taken away once you finally own it. Wealth is a coat you can lose. Land is a fence that can fall. But the integrity of knowing who you are, that is a fortress. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man who had whispered a lie to me on a porch, only to find a truth he wasn't ready for. I believe in you, Wyatt, I whispered. And I believe in the woman who found a map in the dark, he replied. The candle died. The room went black. But for the first time since I stepped off that stagecoach in Bitter Creek, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel like a Goa foo with a ledger. I felt like Clara Penrose. And I was home. We stayed there in the dark for a long time, just listening to us settle, listening to the wind. It was the sound of a story changing. It was the sound of a world becoming real. Tomorrow, I said. Tomorrow, he agreed. And as I walked back to my room, I knew that whatever happened in that courtroom, everything had changed. The engagement was a lie. The audit was a mess. But the kiss was the only thing that made sense. Because you can't fake the way the world tilts when you finally find the person you were supposed to stand with. And I wasn't going back to Denver. Not without a fight. The sun didn't rise the next morning. It just sort of leaked into the sky. A gray, bruised color. It matched the way I felt. I was in the barn, cinching the saddle on my bay. My hands were moving by habit. Muscle memory. My mind was back in that dark room with Clara and the map. The secret was out. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a name, it had a face, it had her father's handwriting. I heard her boots on the dirt before I saw her. She didn't sneak up. She walked like she had a right to the ground she was on. I liked that about her. I'd always liked that. We need to finish this, Wyatt, she said. She was holding the map. It was folded neat, but the edges were frayed, like our lives. I stopped, pulling the cinch. I turned to look at her. She was standing in a shaft of dusty light. I believe that every human being has a right to know the ground they stand on, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart doing a slow, heavy roll in my chest. To keep a person in the dark about their own heritage is a crime against their soul. Knowledge isn't just power, Clara. It's just the basic requirement for a person to be free. Without the truth, we just sleepwalking through someone else's dream. Clara stepped closer. The smell of hay and old wood filled the space between us. You knew, she said. It wasn't a question. You knew before I found that box. You knew when you asked me to pretend. I took a breath. The air tasted of dust and iron. I knew, I had admitted, and I believe that a man who starts a journey on a lie has a heavy debt to pay before he reaches the end. I saw your name on the Auditor S list from Denver. Clara Penrose. It was like seeing a ghost walk into the room. I've known for years that the Sterling name was built on a foundation of Penrose dirt. I've been waiting, Clara. Not for a wife, not for a lawyer. I've been waiting for a reckoning. She flinched just a little, like I struck a match too close to her face. Why the engagement, then? She asked. Why the game? I walked over to the barn door and looked out at the rolling hills. The Sterling Ranch, I believes, require than just handing over a piece of paper, I said. I turned back to her. If I had just given you the land, you would have felt like a charity case. Or you would have fled out of fear. I wanted you to see it first. I wanted you to work it. I wanted you to fall in love with the creek and the ridges. so that when you finally owned it, you would know exactly what it was worth. I believe that a person truly owns only what they have invested their heart into. To give someone a gift they don't understand is to give them a burden, not a blessing. Clara looked at the map in her hand. Then she looked at me. You were going to give it all away? All of this? It was never mine to keep, I said. I believe that we are not owners of the earth. We are merely guardians, and a guardian's first duty is to ensure that the property reaches its rightful hand. To cling to what was stolen is to become a thief yourself. I didn't want to be a thief, Clara. I wanted to be the man who finally stopped the fire. She sat down on a hay bale. She looked small in the vastness of the barn, but she looked strong, too. Gideon won't let you, she said. He believes that might makes right. He believes that the person with the loudest voice and the most gold owns the truth. How do we fight a man who doesn't believe in the basic right of others to exist? I sat down near her, not too close. I wanted to give her space to breathe. I believe that the only way to fight a man like Gideon is to be so rooted in your own truth that he can pull you up, I said. A man who stands on a lie is always off balance. He has to keep pushing to stay upright. But a person who stands on the facts, they have the whole weight of the earth supporting them. We fight him by being honest, even when it costs us the ranch, especially when it costs us the ranch. Clara looked up. She touched her jaw right where I had kissed her at the social. And the kiss, Wyatt, she asked. Was that part of the guardianship? Was that just another way to make me invest my heart? I felt the heat climb into my neck. I believe that even in the middle of a plan, a man can be surprised by his own humanity, I said. My voice was lower now, rhythmic. I believe that every person has a right to be loved for who they are, not for what they can do for someone else. That's kiss. It wasn't in the ledgers, Clara. It wasn't part of the audit. It was the first time in my life I felt like I wasn't just a guardian of a ghost. I felt like a man who had finally found his equal. And I believed that a partner between equals is the only thing stronger than the law. Clara stood up. She reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm. I believe that equality isn't something a man gives to a woman, she said. It's something he recognizes. I am your equal, Wyatt, not because you let me be, but because I am, and I believe that if we were going to lose this place, we should lose it together. Standing tall. No more pretending. No more pretending, I agreed. But I knew the cost. If we told the truth, the morality clause would bite. Gideon would use the conflict of interest to throw us both out. We'd be standing on the road with nothing but our names. I believe that a name is the only thing a person truly owns at the end of the day, I said, looking at her. You can lose your gold. You can lose your house. But if you keep your name clean, you still have your dignity. And a person with dignity can always build a new house. But a person who loses their soul to keep a roof, they read just living in a fancy grave. Clara nodded. She folded the map one last time and tucked it into her bodice right against her heart. Let's go find Judge Thorne, she said. We walked out of the barn. The gray sky was breaking. Streaks of yellow were cutting through the clouds. It wasn't a pretty morning, but it was a clear one. I looked at the land, the Sterling Ranch, my father's pride, my father's shame. I wasn't scared anymore. I believe that fear is just the sound of a lie trying to stay alive. I whispered to the wind, and today the lie is finally going to die. We rode toward Bitter Creek. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. The rhythm of the horses was enough. We were two people riding toward a storm, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was riding in the right direction, because I believe that the truth is a compass. It doesn't always lead you to the easiest path, but it always leads you home. And Clara Penrose was the only home I had left. As we reached the edge of town, I saw Gideon S. buggy parked in front of the courthouse. He was standing on the steps, talking to a group of men. He looked like a king. He looked like a man who had already won. He saw us. He tipped his hat, a slow, mocking gesture. Clara didn't look away. She sat tall in the saddle. She looked like a Penrose. I believe that every person deserves a day where they stand in the light, I said to her as we dismounted. Today's yours, Clara. What Gideon says, this is the day the truth catches up. She looked at the courthouse. Then she looked at me. No, she said. It's our day, Wyatt. We stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under our feet. It was time to open the books. It was time to settle the tally. And I knew, regardless of the verdict, I had already found the only thing worth keeping. A partner who knew the value of the truth, and a kiss that had made everything real. The Bitter Creek courthouse smelled of floor wax and old tobacco. It was a heavy smell. It felt like the air was trying to push you down. I sat on a hard wooden bench. My back was straight. My hands were folded in my lap. I didn't let them fidget. Wyatt was beside me. He was too big for the bench. He looked like a wild horse caught in a small pen. I could feel the heat coming off him. I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He didn't look at Gideon. He didn't look at the lawyer, Vance. He looked at the flag behind the judge's desk. Judge Thorne entered. We all stood up. The wood groaned under our feet. It was a sound I'd heard many times in my life. The sound of people waiting for someone else to decide their fate. Sit, Thorne said. He didn't waste words. His lawyer, Vance, didn't wait. He stood up immediately. He smoothed his dark coat. He looked at me like I was a piece of bad fruit he'd had found in a basket. Your Honor, Vance began. His voice was high and sharp. We are here to discuss the morality clause of the Sterling estate, but we are also here to discuss a fraud. A professional fraud. Miss Clara Penrose, sent by the McNally firm to be an impartial auditor, has been living at the Sterling Ranch. She has claimed an engagement to the defendant. She has compromised the integrity of her work for a romantic interest. He turned to look at the crowd. He wanted them to see his disgust. I believe that a person's professional standing is their only shield in this world, Vance said, his voice ringing through the room. And I believe that when a woman uses her position to influence a legal outcome through a personal charade, she forfeits her right to be taken seriously. A lie is a lie, Your Honor, whether it is whispered in a barn or written in a ledger. We ask that the audit be dismissed and the land be transferred to Mr. Gideon Sterling immediately. The room was silent. I felt the weight of every eye on me. The widow from Denver, the Fro. Judge Thorne looked at me. Miss Penrose, you wish to speak? I stood up. My knees felt like they were made of water, but I forced them to hold. I walked to the center of the room. I didn't look at Wyatt. I do, he said. I took a breath. I let it out, slow. I believe that every human being has a fundamental right to stand on their own truth, even when that truth is messy, I said. My voice was clear yet rhythmic. It didn't shake. I believe that justice is not a cold machine. It is a living thing that must take into account the heart and the history of the people involved. To suggest that my competence is erased because of my feelings is to suggest that a human being is nothing more than a machine, and I am not a machine. I looked at Gideon. He was leaning back, a smug smile on his face. I believe that the integrity of a person is not found in their perfection, but in their willingness to admit where they were wrong for the sake of what is right. I continued. Yes, the engagement was a pretense. We were afraid we were fighting a man who uses the law as a club. But the pretense died the moment I found the map, the moment I realized that my own father's history was buried under the floorboards of the Sterling Ranch. I pulled the map from my bodice. I held it up. The gray light of the window hit the frayed edges. I believe that a person's dignity is tied to their heritage, I said, looking at the judge. To deny a person the knowledge of their own father's struggles is to deny them their place in the world. This land, the Penrose Patch, was stolen through silence and fire. I didn't stay because of a fake engagement. I stayed because I realized that I had a right to be here, not as a fiancé, not as an auditor, but as a daughter. And I believe that the law should protect the daughter's right to the truth as much as the uncle's right to a contract. Vance jumped up. Irrelevant. The past is not on trial here. Sit down, Vance, Judge Thorne growled. He leaned forward. He looked at the map in my hand. Then he looked at Wyatt. Mr. Sterling, you knew about this. Wyatt stood up. He walked to my side. He didn't touch me, but the space between us was gone. I knew, Wyatt said. His voice was deep. It filled the courthouse. And I believe that a man who keeps a secret that hurts another is a man who is slowly killing his own soul. I believe that the land belongs to cherish it and those who have suffered for it. I was ready to give it all away. I was ready to sign the deed over to Clara because I believe that restitution is the only way to find peace. A legacy built on a lie is a heavy thing to carry. I am tired of carrying it. Wyatt looked at Gideon. I believe that every person deserves to be seen for who they are, not for what can be taken from them. Gideon sees land. He sees gold. He doesn't see people. But Clara Penrose is a person of immense value. She is my equal in every sense of the word. And I believe that a society that doesn't recognize the equality and dignity of its citizens, regardless of their gender or their past, is a society that is bound to fail. Judge Thorne stayed quiet for a long time. He looked at me. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the map. I believe that the purpose of the law is to serve the living, not the ghosts of the past. Thorne said finally. His voice was like stones grinding together. But I also believe that we cannot build a future on a foundation of deceit. Miss Penrose, your audit is compromised. I cannot accept it as an impartial document. Gideon let out a loud, triumphant breath. However, Thorne continued, silencing Gideon with a look, I believe that the evidence of the 1856 map creates a significant cloud over the title of the Sterling Ranch. I will not transfer this land today. I am ordering a full, independent investigation into the Penn's claim. And until that investigation is complete, the ranch will remain under the guardianship of Wyatt Sterling. Thorne looked at Gideon, and I believe that a man who attempts to use a morality clause to hide a history of theft is a man who lacks the very morality he claims to uphold. Case adjourned for 30 days. He slammed his gavel. The room exploded into noise. Gideon was shouting at Vance. The townspeople were whispering, but I didn't hear them. I felt a hand on my arm. Wyatt, we have 30 days, he whispered. We have the truth, I said. We walked out of the courthouse. The air outside felt fresh. The gray clouds were finally moving. We stood on the porch, the same place we had stood that first day. I believe that true freedom is not about having everything you want, I said, looking out at the dusty street of Bitter Creek. It's just about having the courage to lose everything for the sake of your own integrity. I might lose my career in Denver. You might lose your ranch, but we aren't pretending anymore. Wyatt looked at me. His grip was warm, irreversible. I believe that a person who has found someone to stand with is never truly poor, he said. We'll fight the investigation, we'll tell the story, and we do it together. Because I believe that the bond I've found, the one that started with a lie and ended with a kiss, is the only thing that actually matters. I looked at the hills in the distance, the decent Penrose patch, my father's land. I believe that we are finally starting to live, Wyatt, I whispered. I believe you rewrite, Clara, he said. We walked down the steps. We were two people with a heavy road ahead of them, but we were walking in the light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't auditing a tragedy. I was building a future, because I believe that even in the toughest soil, if you plant the truth, something beautiful will eventually grow. The ride back from the courthouse was long. The dust seemed heavier than usual. It stuck to my throat. It stuck to my clothes. It felt like the weight of the last 20 years finally deciding to settle into my bones. Clara rode beside me. She did say a word. She did have to. We were both vibrating with the same strange energy. Part relief, part terror. We had told the truth, but the truth had left us standing in a field of ruins. When we reached the ranch, I didn't go inside. I went to the barn. I needed to work. I needed to feel the wood and the leather. I needed to remind myself that I was still a man with hands that could build, even if the world I did build was crumbling. I was in the middle of oiling a saddle when I heard a buggy pull up. I knew the sound. Gideon. He didn't come to the house. He came straight to the barn. He stood in the doorway, blocking the afternoon sun. He looked smaller than he had in the courtroom. Or maybe I just felt bigger. You think you won something today, Wyatt? Gideon asked. His voice was thin, like old paper. I didn't stop oiling the leather. I believe that winning and losing are just stories we tell ourselves to avoid looking at what we've actually done, I said. My voice was low, rhythmic. A man can own a whole valley and still be a loser if he has lost his soul to get it. And a man can stand on a dusty road with nothing and be a winner if he can still look at himself in a mirror without flinching. I didn't win today, Gideon. I just stopped lying. Gideon walked into the barn. He looked around at the tools, the hay, the horses. You were throwing away a dynasty for a woman who arrived 3 weeks ago, he said. For a ghost of a man who couldn't keep his own fire burning. Urea Sterling. We take. We hold. That's how the world works. I stopped then. I put down the rag. I looked at my uncle. I saw the lines in his face. I saw the greed in his eyes. And for the first time, I felt sorry for him. I believe that every human being has a right to be more than their heritage, I said. I stepped toward him. We are born into families, but we aren't born into cages. To say the Wampus act a certain way because of our name is to deny our basic right to grow. I believe that a person's true identity is formed by the choices they make today, not by the mistakes their grandfather made in 1856. You think you re a Sterling, Gideon, but I think you re just a man who's afraid to find out who he is without the land. Gideon's face went red. He curled his hands into fists. You talk like a preacher, he spat. But you re just a fool. You re giving her the key to the vault. She take the Penrose patch and she leave you with the rocks and the brush. She says an auditor, Wyatt, she knows exactly what you re worth. I believe that the value of a person cannot be calculated on a ledger, I replied. And I believe that the greatest poverty a man can suffer is the inability to trust another human being. To live your life thinking everyone is out to steal from you is a lonely, cold way to exist. I trust Clara, not because she is an auditor, but because she is a person who knows the weight of the truth. And I believe that trust is the only thing that actually makes a life worth living. Gideon laughed. It was a jagged sound. She's a Penrose. They re-leeches. They always were. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. I believe that every person deserves to be judged by their own actions, not by a label someone else slapped on their family name, I said. Stereotypes are just an excuse for people who are too lazy to look at the truth. To call a whole group of people leeches is a violation of their dignity. It's a way of making them less than human so you don't have to feel bad about taking from them. I won't listen to that talk in this barn, Gideon. Not today. Not ever. Gideon looked at me for a long time. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something cruel. But the words wouldn't come. He turned and walked out of the barn. I heard the buggy pull away. A few minutes later, kind of like Claire walked, he had two cousins. She said. The silence of two people who had said everything that needed to be said. I found something, she said. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. It was a fresh document. Clean ink. What is it? It's a deed of stewardship, she said. I wrote it this afternoon. It says that regardless of the investigation, I recognize your right to live on and manage this land. And it says that if the Penrose claim is upheld, I will enter into a legal partnership with you. Equal shares, equal voice. I looked at the paper, then I looked at her. Why? I asked. You have the law on your side now. You have the map. Clara took a sip of her coffee. I believe that justice is not just about returning what was stolen, she said. Her voice was clear. It is about building something new on the ground that was cleared. To take this land and push you off would just be repeating the cycle of 1856. It would be an act of revenge, not an act of restoration. I believe that true compassion requires us to see the humanity in everyone, even the people who represent the things we hate. You aren't your father, Wyatt, and I believe you have a right to the life you've built here, just as much as I have a right to the history he tried to hide. I felt a lump in my throat. I cleared it. I believe that the most powerful thing a person can do is to offer mercy when they have the power to take vengeance, I said. Mercy isn't weakness, Clara. It's the ultimate form of strength. It's the choice to be better than the world that hurt you. To offer me a partnership after what my family did to yours, that is a level of grace I didn't think existed in Bitter Creek. Clara touched my hand. I believe that we are all responsible for the world we leave behind, she said. And I believe that a world built on partnership and equality is a world where everyone can finally breathe. I don't want to own you, Wyatt, and I don't want you to own me. I want us to stand together. Because I believe that two people standing together are harder to break than one person standing alone on a hill. I looked out the barn door. The sun was setting. The shadows were long. I have something for you, too, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver ring. It wasn't fancy. It was a simple band with a small engraved rose. This was my mother, I said. She kept it hidden from my father. She said it was the only thing she owned that he hadn't bought for her. She told me to give it to someone who understood the value of a quiet heart. I held it out to her. I believe that a gift should represent a commitment to another person's freedom, not an attempt to bind them, I said. This isn't a performance for the judge. It's not a lie for Gideon. It's a promise. A promise that I will always see you as my equal, that I will always defend your route to your own story, and that I will spend the rest of my days trying to be a man who is worthy of the truth you brought to this ranch. Clara took the ring. She looked at it for a long time. Then she slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. I believe that love is the only thing that can actually settle a debt of honor, she whispered, because love doesn't count the cost. It doesn't look at the ledgers. It just looks at the person. I accept your promise, Wyatt, and I give you mine. I believe that we are finally finished with the pretending. We stood up together. We walked out of the barn and toward the house. The ranch was quiet. The horses were settled. The land was still the land. But it felt different. It felt like it was finally at peace. As we reached the porch, I stopped. I looked at the front door. I believe that every person deserves a home where they are truly known, I said. Not for their name, not for their job, but for their soul. Welcome home, Clara. She smiled. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I believe I'm already there, she said. We walked inside. The shadows of the past were still there, tucked in the corners. But we weren't afraid of them anymore. Because I believe that when you bring enough light into a room, the shadows don't disappear. They just become part of the story. And our story was just beginning. Later that night, I sat by the window. I thought about Gideon. I thought about my father. I thought about the man I had seen in the mirror for 38 years. He looked different now. His eyes were clearer. His shoulders were lighter. I realized that Gideon wasn't just my uncle. He was a mirror. He was a warning of what happens when a person believes that things are more important than people. He was a man who had built a wall of gold and was now surprised that he couldn't hear the music of the world outside it. I believe that true success is measured by the quality of the relationships we nurture, not by the quantity of the possessions we accumulate, I whispered to the empty room. A man who is loved by a person like Clara Penrose is the richest man in Texas, even if he doesn't own a single acre of dirt. Because possessions can be stolen, they can be burnt, they can be lost in a hearing. But the respect and love of an equal, that is an eternal asset. I heard Clara moving in the kitchen, the sound of a kettle, the sound of a life being lived. I closed my eyes. I believe that every day is a chance to be a better version of ourselves, I thought. And I believe that as long as we have the courage to face the truth, we will always find our way. The enemy in the mirror was gone. In his place was a man who knew his value, a man who knew his partner, a man who was finally irreversibly real. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. It was day 19. The 3 weeks Wyatt had asked for were almost up. I stood in the dusty street of Bitter Creek, holding that yellow slip of paper. The ink was cold. The words were shorter than a breath. Client complaint, received. Conflict of interest, side. Your scripts with Empson Elise and Associates are to terminated effective immediately. Do not return to Denver office. I folded the paper. I put it in my pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I felt light, like a bird that had finally been pushed out of a very small, very safe cage. I walked back toward the ranch. The walk took 2 hours. I didn't hurry. I wanted to feel the sun. I wanted to hear the grass. I wanted to think about what I was losing and what I was finding. Wyatt was at the corral when I arrived. He was leaning against the fence, watching young colt find its legs. He saw my face. He saw the way I was holding my shoulders. He knew. Denver. Say he was sorry. I believe that a person's career is not the sum of their life. My voice was steady, rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. And I believe that every human being has the right to change their direction when the path they were on turns out to be a dead end. Society tells us that our identity is tied to our title auditor, widow, manager. But I believe our true identity is found in our character. I lost a job to Wyatt, but I didn't lose my mind. And I certainly didn't lose my value as a human being. Wyatt handed the paper back to me. I believe that the hardest thing for a person to do is to let go of the safety they know for the sake of the truth they just found. You re a brave woman. Clara. Most people would have lied to keep that office in Denver. They would have buried the map. They would have finished the audit and taken the paycheck. I believe that the right to choose one's own destiny is the most precious thing we own. You chose yours today, even if it cost you everything you used to be. I'm not finished choosing, I said. We walked toward the house. The shadows of the porch were long and cool. We sat on the steps, side by side. Our shoulders were touching. It felt natural. It felt like we'd been sitting there for 20 years. I found something in the office today, Wyatt said. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. It was old. The paper was thick. Another map? I asked. We signed it 5 days ago, before the social, before the kiss. He handed it to me. It was a legal transfer. It released all Sterling claims to the northwest quadrant of the valley, the Penrose Patch. It was signed by Wyatt, witnessed by Judge Thorne, and dated before the scandal broke. I looked at him. I was confused. You did this before the hearing? Why didn't you tell me? I believe that love is only real if it's given in complete freedom, Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet afternoon. I believe that a man who tries to trap a woman with a deed or a debt doesn't understand what love is. I wanted that paper to be there in case you decided to leave. I wanted you to have your land, Clara. I wanted you to have your history. But I wanted you to have it without feeling like you owed me anything. I believe that every person deserves to be the master of their own life. If I had used that paper to make you stay, I would have been no better than Gideon. I looked at the document. My father S. land, given back to me by the son of the man who took it. I believe that a gift given in secret is the truest form of kindness, I said. I felt a warmth in my throat. And I believe that your willingness to let me go is the very thing that makes me want to stay. We are taught that to love someone is to hold on to them tight. But I believe that true love is about holding the door wide open and trusting that the other person will choose to walk back in. You didn't just give me land, Wyatt. You gave me my dignity. You recognized my right to be independent. Wyatt looked out at the hills. I believe that equality is the only foundation a house can stand on, he said. If one person is the master and the other is the servant, the house is a prison. I don't want a wife who stays because she has nowhere else to go. I want a partner who stays because there's nowhere else she'd rather be. I believe that we are finally at a place where the pretending can stop and the living can start. I stood up. I walked to the edge of the porch. I looked at the red Texas dirt. My dirt. The 3 weeks are over, Wyatt said. I know. And the kiss? I turned back to look at him. I believe that some moments in life are irreversible. You can try to walk back the words. You can try to tear up the papers. But you can't undo the way your soul recognizes another. I believe that the kiss we shared wasn't a performance. It was a confession. And once a confession is made, the world is changed forever. Wyatt stood up. He walked over to me. He stood so close I could feel the heat of his breath. I believe that every person has a right to be happy, he whispered.
Not content, not settled.
But truly, deeply happy, and I believe that my happiness is tied to yours. I am a man of few words, Clara, but I am a man of my word. I believe that the future we rebuilding here, a future of shared land and shared truth, is the only thing worth fighting for. I reached up and touched his face. His skin was rough. It felt like the land itself. I believe that we have found the only thing that actually matters in this life, I said. A place where we can be ourselves, without the masks, without the ledgers, and without the lies. I'm staying Wyatt, not as an auditor, not as a victim, but as Clara Penrose, your partner, your equal, your friend. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just leaned down and kissed me again. This time, there was no audience. There was no Gideon watching. There was no Judge Thorne. There was just the wind and the sun and the vast, open heart of Texas. I believe that the truth is a hard thing to find, I thought as I held on to him. But once you find it, it's the only thing that can set you free. The 3 weeks had ended on day 19. The pretend engagement was a ghost, but the reality was irreversible. As the sun began to set, we walked back into the house. It wasn't a Sterling house anymore. It wasn't a Penrose house. It was just a home. And for the first time in 34 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was a woman who had lost everything she was told she needed, only to find everything she actually wanted. I believe that life is a tally of choices, I said to Wyatt as we closed the door against the night. And I believe that today, and we finally got the math right. He smiled. I believe you rewrite. Clara. Outside, the stars began to appear. They were the same stars my father had seen in 1856. They were the same stars that had seen the fire and the fear. But tonight, they were looking down on something new. A promise kept, a debt paid, and a love that was finally, beautifully, real. The 30 days of the investigation lay ahead. There would be more lawyers. There would be more questions. There would be more dust. But I believe that when two people stand together in the truth, the world eventually runs out of lies to tell them. And I was ready for whatever came next. As I lay down that night, I didn't think about Denver. I didn't think about the McNally firm. I thought about the way Wyatt S. hand felt in mine. I thought about the smell of rain on the horizon. I believe that every soul has its destination, I whispered into the dark. And I believe that I've finally arrived. The journey was over. The story was just beginning. And I knew with a certainty that reached down into my very bones that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Bitter Creek wasn't a town built on a dare anymore. It was a town built on the truth, and I was the woman who had helped find it. The final hearing wasn't held in a courtroom, not really. It was held on the porch of the Sterling Ranch, 30 days after the scandal broke. The air was cool. A late autumn breeze carried the scent of dry cedar and coming rain. Judge Thorne sat in a rocking chair, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. Gideon sat across from him, looking like a man who had been chewed up by the very law he tried to weaponize. Wyatt and I stood together, not behind a table, not in a dock, just together. Judge Thorne closed the heavy file. He looked at the horizon for a long time. Then he looked at us. The investigation is complete, Thorne said. His voice was a low rumble. The 1856 map was verified by the county records in Austin. The fire in Bitter Creek didn't reach the state capitol. The title of the Sterling Ranch was built on a fraudulent survey. That is a fact. I believe that a fact is a stubborn thing in living. It doesn't care about the feelings of the men who tried to hide it. I believe that justice is the act of bringing those hidden facts into the light so that the truth can finally breathe. Gideon stood up. His face was pale. So that it? You re-giving it to her? You re-giving the Sterling legacy to a woman with a ledger? I'm not giving anything, Gideon, Thorne replied. I believe that the law does not give rights. It merely recognizes the ones that already exist. Clara Penrose has an inherent right to this land, by blood and by law. To deny her that right would be to deny the very foundation of our society. Every human being has the right to the fruits of their family's labor, and no amount of time can turn a theft into a gift. Wyatt stepped forward. He didn't look at Gideon with anger. He looked at him with a strange kind of pity. I believe that a person's worth is not defined by what they can take from others, but by what they are willing to give back, Wyatt said. His voice was rhythmic, steady as a heartbeat. Gideon, you spent your life trying to protect a name by acting like a man who didn't deserve it. I believe that a name is only as good as the person wearing it. If we kept this land through your schemes, the name Sterling would become a curse in this valley. I believe that the greatest legacy we can leave is a clean path for the people who come after us. And today I am clearing the path. Wyatt looked at me, then back at the judge. He pulled out the document. Clara had drafted the deed of stewardship. I believe that equality is the only way for people to live in peace. Wyatt continued. I believe that no man is the master of a woman, and no woman is a servant to a man. We have signed this deed. We are not owner and fiancé. We are partners, equal in voice, equal in labor, equal in title. I believe that a partnership of equals is the highest form of human relationship, and it is the only one I am willing to live in. Clara stepped up beside him. She looked at Gideon, then at the judge. I believe that true stewardship is not about owning the earth, but about taking care of it for the next generation, Clara said. Her voice was clear, sounding like a bell in the quiet afternoon. I believe that the land doesn't really belong to anyone. We are just passing through. But while we are here, we have a responsibility to be fair. We have a responsibility to recognize the rights of every person to a fair shake and clean slate. I don't want to win against you, Gideon. I want the truth to win. Because I believe that when the truth wins, everyone, even the people who lost, can finally stop fighting. Gideon looked at the deed. He looked at the two of us. He didn't say another word. He walked down the porch steps, got into his buggy, and drove away. He didn't look back. Judge Thorne stood up. He shook Wyatt's hand. Then he shook mine. I believe that Bitter Creek is going to be a better place because of the two of you, Thorne said. I believe that most people are afraid of the truth because they think it will break them. But you two showed them that the truth is the only thing that can actually hold you up. Keep the gates fixed, keep the books straight, and keep that partnership strong. The judge left, his buggy trailing dust into the sunset. Wyatt and I stayed on the porch. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a house that had finally found its peace. 1 year later, the Texas sun was warm on my back as I walked out to the north pasture, the Penrose Patch. The grass was high, waving in the wind like a green ocean. The spring was flowing strong. The cattle were healthy, but that wasn't the best part. The best part was the schoolhouse we debuilt near the creek. I stood by the fence and watched the children playing in the yard. Boys and girls, the children of ranchers and the children of the town. I taught them in the mornings. Wyatt taught them about the land in the afternoons. Wyatt rode up on his bay. He dismounted and walked over to me. He looked older, maybe, but he looked younger too. The weight was gone from his eyes. He leaned against the fence post, watching the kids. I believe that education is the most powerful tool for human that we possess, Wyatt said, looking at the schoolhouse. If we teach these children to respect each other's dignity now, they won't have to fight later. I believe that every child has the right to an equal start, regardless of who their father was or how much gold is in their pockets. To give a child knowledge is to give them the keys to their own freedom. I touched the silver rose ring on my finger. I believe you rewrite, Wyatt, I said, and I believe that we have a duty to tell them the whole story, not just the pretty parts. We have to tell them about 1856. We have to tell them about the fire and the maps, because I believe that a person who doesn't know the mistakes of the past is doomed to repeat them. But a person who understands the struggle for justice is a person who will fight to keep it. Wyatt took my hand. His grip was the same as it had been on day 19. Steady, irreversible. I believe that we are finally living the life we were meant to live, he said. A life built on the truth. A life built on respect. I believe that love is not about two people looking at each other, but about two people looking outward in the same direction. And I like the direction we reheaded, Clara. I looked at the horizon, the Bitter Creek ridges, the vast open sky. I believe that the land is finally happy, I whispered. It's not being fought over anymore. It's being cherished. And I believe that people belong to the land far more than the land belongs to us. If we treat the land with kindness, it returns that kindness. If we treat each other with dignity, the world becomes a place worth living in. We stood there for a long time, just breathing in the Texas air. The pretend engagement was a story we told sometimes, a lesson about fear and how it can make you do strange things. But the kiss was a story we kept for ourselves. I believe that some things are too sacred for ledgers, I thought, as I leaned my head against Wyatt's shoulder. And I believe that a quiet heart is the greatest treasure a person can find. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the children's laughter from the schoolhouse. It was a rhythmic, happy sound. It was the sound of a future being built. I believe that every human being has the capacity for change, Wyatt said, as if reading my thoughts. And I believe that as long as there is a sunrise, there is a chance to make things right. I looked at him, my partner, my equal, my truth. I believe you, I said. We walked back toward the house together. Two people, one life, no more pretending. The shadows of the porch were short in the midday sun. The door was open. The table was set. As we crossed the threshold, I knew with a certainty that surpassed any audit or any deed. I believe that the truth didn't just set us free, it brought us home. And in the grand tally of the world, that was the only number that ever really mattered.
As Clara Penrose and Wyatt Sterling stood together beneath the wide Texas sky, their story reminded us that the hardest battles in life are not always fought with guns, fists, or loud words. Sometimes the greatest battle is the quiet one inside the human heart, the battle between fear and honesty, pride and humility, revenge and compassion. Clara came to Bitter Creek believing she was only there to examine ledgers and settle accounts, but what she truly found was a buried history, a stolen dignity, and a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Wyatt, born into a name heavy with guilt, could have chosen comfort, silence, and inheritance. Instead, he chose courage. He chose to face what his family had done, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The meaning of this story is that truth may shake the ground beneath us, but it also gives us a place to stand. A lie can protect a house for a while, but only honesty can build a home. Clara and Wyatt teach us that love is not about possession, control, or saving face in front of the world. Real love is respect. Real love is freedom. Real love is standing beside someone as an equal, even when the cost is high. Their bond began as a pretend engagement, but it became something far deeper because both of them were willing to stop pretending, not only to the town, but to themselves. This story also reminds us that justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes, justice means restoration. It means giving back what was taken, speaking the names that were silenced, and allowing old wounds to finally breathe in the light. Clara could have used the truth to destroy Wyatt, but she chose partnership over revenge. Wyatt could have hidden the past to protect his land, but he chose integrity over ownership. And in doing so, they showed us that mercy is not weakness. Mercy is the strength to break a cycle of pain instead of passing it on. For every viewer listening tonight, The lesson is simple but powerful. We are not defined by the mistakes of those who came before us, but by how we answer them. We are not measured by the land we own, the money we hold, or the title others give us, but by the honesty of our choices and the kindness we show when we have the power to do harm. In the end, Bitter Creek was not healed by a deed, a courtroom, or a judge's ruling. It was healed by two people brave enough to tell the truth. Forgive the past and build something better together. And perhaps that is the greatest value this story leaves behind. When truth is planted in even the hardest soil, love, justice, and peace can still grow.